The train whistle echoed through the Colorado mountains as Sarah Mitchell clutched the worn letter in her trembling hands. 3 pairs of young eyes watching her every expression from the cramped passenger car seats. She had read Henry Walsh's proposal 100 times during their journey west, each word promising safety, security, and a fresh start for her and the 3 orphaned sisters she'd sworn to protect. What the letter hadn't mentioned was the smell of smoke that would greet them at Millbrook Valley Station, or the eerie silence that would replace the bustling community Henry had described in his careful penmanship. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The youngest sister, 8-year-old Rose, pressed her nose against the window as the train began its final descent into the valley. Her golden curls bounced as she pointed excitedly at something in the distance, but her smile faded quickly when she realized what she was seeing. Where Henry had promised a thriving town with white-painted houses and busy streets, only charred ruins and empty foundations remained scattered across the valley floor like broken teeth. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered the few possessions they'd brought from Chicago, her mind racing to make sense of what lay before them. 16-year-old Emma, always too mature for her years, had gone pale as she helped. 12-year-old Lucy packed their small bundle of belongings. The girls had already endured so much loss in their young lives, and Sarah had promised them this journey would be different, that Henry Walsh would give them the family they'd never truly had. The conductor's voice boomed through the car as they pulled into what remained of Millbrook Valley Station. The platform, though intact, stood completely deserted except for a lone figure in a dusty brown coat who seemed to be waiting specifically for their arrival. Sarah gathered her courage and stepped down from the train first, her practical boots hitting the wooden planks with a hollow sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the unnatural quiet. Sheriff Daniel Cooper had been dreading this moment for 3 weeks. He'd sent telegrams to every station between Denver and Millbrook Valley, trying to warn the bride-to-be about what had happened to Henry Walsh and the rest of the town. But the messages had either arrived too late or gotten lost in the chaos that followed the massacre. Now here she stood, a woman in her late 20s with intelligent green eyes and auburn hair, neatly pinned beneath a simple bonnet, clearly expecting to begin a new life that no longer existed. Sarah's first impression of the sheriff was that he looked like a man carrying the weight of impossible decisions. His dark hair needed cutting, and the lines around his blue eyes spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. When he removed his hat and approached them with the careful deliberation of someone delivering terrible news, Sarah instinctively moved closer to the girls, her protective instincts already sensing danger. "Ma'am," Sheriff Cooper began, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I'm Sheriff Daniel Cooper. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Mr. Walsh and the town." He glanced at the 3 girls clustered behind Sarah's skirts, clearly struggling with how much to reveal in front of such young ears. "Perhaps we should speak privately first." Emma stepped forward with the poise of someone who'd grown up too fast. "We've already lost our parents, Sheriff. Whatever happened here, we can handle the truth." Her voice carried a steadiness that impressed Cooper, though he could see the fear she was trying to hide behind her brave words. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder while studying the sheriff's face. Years of caring for the girls had taught her to read people quickly, to assess whether they could be trusted with precious lives. Something in Cooper's demeanor, the way he'd removed his hat before speaking, and the genuine pain in his eyes when he looked at the children, told her this was a man who still believed in doing right even when everything around him had gone wrong. 3 weeks ago, Cooper continued, a gang led by a man called Black Jack Reynolds hit the town. They'd been tracking rumors about silver deposits near the Copper Creek mine. Thought there might be more money here than anyone was letting on. He paused, watching Sarah's face carefully. They were wrong about the silver, but by the time they figured that out, they'd already done considerable damage. Lucy, always the most observant of the sisters, had been quietly studying the burned buildings visible from the station platform. How many people got hurt? She asked in the direct way that only children could manage, cutting straight to the heart of what the adults were dancing around. Cooper knelt down to meet Lucy's eyes, recognizing that she deserved an honest answer. Too many, sweetheart. Including Mr. Walsh, I'm sorry to say. He looked up at Sarah, seeing the way her face had gone pale. The gang took what they could. Find and burned most of the rest. About 30 people managed to get away when the shooting started. But the town you came here to join doesn't exist anymore. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the train preparing to leave, its whistle seeming almost mocking in the devastation that surrounded them. Sarah felt Rose's small hand slip into hers, and she squeezed it gently while trying to process the magnitude of what they'd walked into. The little money she had left wouldn't be enough to buy train tickets back to Chicago, even if there had been anything left for them there. Where are the people who escaped? Sarah asked, her practical mind already working through their options. Surely some of them are planning to rebuild. Cooper's expression grew even more grim. Most headed east to Denver or Colorado Springs. A few are holed up at the church about a mile outside town. Father Santos refuses to abandon the place entirely. But Miss Mitchell, he paused, clearly struggling with what he needed to tell her next. Reynolds and his gang are still in the area. They're using the mountains as a base while they hit other settlements. It's not safe here for anyone, especially not for a woman traveling alone with children. Emma had been listening to every word with the intensity of someone whose survival had often depended on understanding adult conversations. But you're still here, she pointed out, studying the sheriff's face. Why haven't you left with everyone else? The question seemed to hit Cooper like a physical blow. He stood slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to the badge pinned to his vest, because those men killed my friends, burned down my town, and murdered innocent people. Someone needs to make sure they answer for what they've done. His voice carried a quiet determination that reminded Sarah of her own father, who died fighting for the Union when she was barely older than Emma. Rose tugged on Sarah's skirt, with the persistence that only 8-year-olds could muster. Are we going back on the train? She asked, her voice small and uncertain. The question hung in the air like smoke, because they all knew the answer wasn't that simple. Sarah looked around at the ruins of what should have been their new home, then at the 3 faces depending on her to somehow make everything work out. The practical part of her mind was already calculating their limited options, while another part, the part that had learned to fight for survival on Chicago's harsh streets before marrying and losing her first husband, was beginning to assess the situation differently. Sheriff Cooper, she said finally, tell me about this gang. How many men are we talking about, and what exactly are they after now that they know there's no silver here? Cooper studied her face, surprised by the directness of her question. Most women in her situation would be focused on escape routes, not gathering intelligence about dangerous criminals. Reynolds has maybe 15 men with him, maybe 20. They're experienced, well-armed, and they've been living off robbery and intimidation for years. Without the silver they expected, they'll likely keep hitting farms and small towns until someone stops them or they move on to easier territory. Lucy had wandered closer to the edge of the platform and was pointing toward a column of smoke, rising from beyond a grove of cottonwood trees. Sheriff, is that where the people are staying, at the church? Cooper nodded, following her gaze. Father Santos has been tending to the wounded and providing shelter for anyone who doesn't want to leave. There's also Doc Hayes and Clara Henderson from the general store. They're good people, but they're not equipped to defend themselves if Reynolds decides to come back. Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she'd had years ago when she'd first taken responsibility for Emma after their parents died in the cholera outbreak. It was the feeling of recognizing a fight that needed fighting, even when the smart thing would be to walk away. She'd spent the last 8 years learning to be respectable, to fit into the role of a proper widow, seeking a second chance at marriage and family. But before that, before she'd learned to hide her sharper edges behind gentle smiles and careful manners, she'd been someone else entirely. "How far is it to the church?" she asked, already knowing she'd made her decision. Cooper's eyebrows rose slightly. "About a mile through those trees, but Miss Mitchell, I really think you should consider taking the next train east. This isn't the kind of situation where good intentions matter much against men like Reynolds and his gang." Emma stepped closer to Sarah, and Lucy unconsciously moved to flank her other side, while Rose maintained her grip on Sarah's hand. They'd learned to recognize the moments when Sarah shifted from their gentle guardian into something more formidable, and they knew better than to question her when that particular tone entered her voice. "Sheriff," Sarah said, her green eyes meeting his steadily, "I appreciate your concern, but we didn't come all this way just to turn around at the first sign of trouble. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If there are people at that church who need help, and if you're planning to go after the men who did this, then perhaps we can be of more assistance than you might expect." Cooper found himself studying her face more carefully, noting the set of her jaw and the way she held herself. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of soldiers he'd known during the war, people who'd learned that sometimes the only way through a bad situation was straight ahead. But she was still a woman with 3 children to protect, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important about who exactly Sarah Mitchell really was. "Ma'am, I'm not sure you understand what you'd be getting into," he began, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Sheriff Cooper, let me ask you something. How long have you been trying to track Reynolds and his gang? And how much success have you had working alone?" The questions hit their mark. Cooper had been chasing shadows for 3 weeks, always arriving at crime scenes hours or days too late. Reynolds seemed to know the mountain country better than Cooper did, and the gang had informants scattered throughout the territory who kept them ahead of any organized pursuit. 3 weeks, he admitted reluctantly, and not nearly enough success. But that doesn't mean adding 4 more people to protect is going to improve the situation. Sarah smiled for the first time since stepping off the train, but it wasn't the gentle, reassuring smile she usually wore for the children. This smile had edges that reminded Cooper of drawn steel. Who said anything about needing protection? Lucy had been following the conversation with the intensity she usually reserved for particularly interesting books. "Sarah has skills," she announced matter-of-factly, earning surprised looks from both adults. "She taught us how to shoot and how to track and how to move quietly. She knows things." Emma nodded in agreement. "Sarah's not just our guardian," she explained to the sheriff. "Before she married Mr. Mitchell in Chicago, she worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. She told us about it when we were old enough to understand." Cooper felt the ground shift beneath his assumptions. Pinkerton agents were known throughout the West as some of the most skilled investigators and fighters in the country. They tracked down train robbers, broke up criminal organizations, and often worked alone in dangerous territory. If Sarah Mitchell had that kind of training and experience, it would explain the way she'd assessed the situation so quickly and the questions she'd asked about Reynolds and his gang. "You're a Pinkerton agent?" he asked, unable to keep the surprise out of his voice. Sarah's expression became carefully neutral. "I was for several years before I married Thomas Mitchell. I left the agency when I took responsibility for the girls, because that life wasn't compatible with providing them with the stability they needed." She paused, watching his reaction. "But skills like that don't just disappear because you stop using them professionally." Rose looked up at Sarah with wide eyes. "Does that mean you're like the lady detectives in the dime novels?" "Something like that, sweetheart," Sarah replied, ruffling Rose's curls. though the real work was usually much less exciting than what they write in those stories. Cooper was rapidly reassessing everything he thought he knew about the situation. A former Pinkerton agent with 3 children to protect might actually be exactly what he needed to finally corner Reynolds and his gang. But it would also mean putting those children in danger, something that went against every instinct he had as both a lawman and a decent human being. Even if you do have that kind of experience, he said carefully, this is still an incredibly dangerous situation. These men have killed innocent people, including children. Are you really willing to risk the lives of these girls for revenge against men you've never met? Sarah's expression hardened. Sheriff, these girls have been my responsibility for 8 years. I've kept them safe through Chicago winters without enough food, through cholera outbreaks, through more dangers than you can imagine. I didn't bring them all the way to Colorado to hide from the first real threat we encounter. She gestured toward the burned town. Henry Walsh promised us a home here, a community where the girls could grow up safely. Reynolds took that away from us just like he took it away from everyone else. Emma stepped forward, her young face set with determination. We're not afraid, Sheriff Cooper. Sarah taught us that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. Lucy nodded enthusiastically. And we're good at helping. We know how to be quiet and watch for things and follow directions. Cooper looked at the 4 faces in front of him, from 8-year-old Rose with her golden curls and trusting eyes, to Sarah with her steady gaze and carefully controlled manner that spoke of hidden depths. The practical part of his mind was already imagining how much easier it would be to track Reynolds with someone who had actual investigative training. The protective part was screaming warnings about putting children in danger. If I were to consider this, he said slowly, what exactly are you proposing? Sarah's smile returned, and this time it carried the confidence of someone who'd found solid ground. First, we go to the church and assess the situation with the survivors. Then we develop a real plan for tracking Reynolds instead of just chasing him blindly through the mountains. I assume you've been working alone because there's no organized law enforcement in this territory? The territorial marshal is based in Denver, 3 days' ride from here, Cooper confirmed. By the time I could get word to him and bring back help, Reynolds will be long gone or will have hit 6 more settlements. Then we do this ourselves, Sarah said simply. But we do it smart. Reynolds has been successful because he's been fighting amateurs and isolated communities. He's not expecting to face someone with professional training who knows how to turn his own tactics against him. Cooper found himself nodding despite his reservations. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. The church is about a mile through those trees, he said, pointing toward the column of smoke they'd spotted earlier. Father Santos and the others can tell you exactly what happened here and what we're really up against. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to leave the station platform, Cooper noticed how naturally the 3 girls arranged themselves around Sarah, how Emma automatically took responsibility for the smaller bags while Lucy kept one eye on Rose and the other on their surroundings. These weren't just children traveling with a guardian. They were a unit that had learned to function together under difficult circumstances. The walk to the church took them through what had once been the heart of Millbrook Valley. Sarah moved through the ruins with the practiced eye of someone trained to read crime scenes, noting details that most people would miss. The pattern of burn damage suggested the fires had been set deliberately rather than spreading accidentally. The way buildings had been destroyed indicated that Reynolds and his men had been looking for something specific, probably money or valuables. That could be easily transported. They were methodical, she observed to Cooper as they passed the remains of what had been the bank. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic robbery. They had a plan and they executed it carefully. Cooper nodded grimly. Reynolds has been doing this for years. He picks targets that seem prosperous but isolated, hits them hard and fast, then disappears before any organized response can be mounted. Millbrook Valley probably looked perfect to him. Successful mining operation, growing population, no military presence nearby. Emma had been studying the ruins with the same intensity as Sarah, and Cooper realized that the girl was learning to see patterns the same way her guardian did. "Sarah," she said quietly, "look at how they positioned the fires. They herded people toward the church, didn't they?" Sarah paused to consider Emma's observation, then nodded approvingly. "Good eye. They wanted the survivors in one place, probably, to make sure they couldn't organize any resistance." She looked at Cooper. "Did anyone try to fight back?" Henry Walsh and a few others tried to organize a defense, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Most of the men here were farmers or merchants, not fighters. Reynolds picked his target well. As they crested a small hill, the church came into view. It was a simple wooden structure with a bell tower, surrounded by a few other buildings that had somehow escaped the destruction. Smoke was rising from a chimney, and they could see people moving around outside, tending to what looked like a small garden and some livestock. Rose pointed excitedly. "There are children there. I can see them playing near the trees." Indeed, there were several small figures visible near the church, and Cooper felt some of his tension ease. At least the survivors had managed to maintain some semblance of normal life despite everything they'd been through. "Remember," Sarah said to the girls as they approached, "these people have been through something terrible. Be respectful, be helpful, and follow my lead." As they walked down the hill toward the church, Cooper found himself wondering if he was making the right decision by agreeing to work with Sarah Mitchell. She clearly had the skills and experience that could make the difference in finally bringing Reynolds to justice. But she also had 3 children depending on her, and he couldn't shake the feeling that involving them in his pursuit of dangerous criminals was a mistake that would haunt him forever. What he didn't know yet was that Sarah Mitchell had her own reasons for wanting to face men like Reynolds, reasons that went deeper than just seeking justice for Henry Walsh or providing safety for the girls. There were parts of her past that she hadn't shared with Cooper, experiences from her Pinkerton, days that had taught her exactly how to handle men who believed that violence and intimidation gave them power over others. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows as they approached the church, and Cooper realized that whatever happened next, the quiet life he'd built in Millbrook Valley was over forever. But looking at Sarah's determined face and the way the 3 girls moved with confident purpose despite everything they'd been through, he was beginning to think that might not necessarily be a bad thing. Father Miguel Santos emerged from the church as their small group approached, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile at the sight of Sheriff Cooper returning with companions. The priest was a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering in recent weeks, yet still held an unshakable faith in human goodness. He wore simple brown robes that had been mended multiple times, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who worked alongside his congregation rather than merely preaching to them. "Daniel," Father Santos called out in accented English, his voice carrying genuine relief. "Thank God you've returned safely. We were beginning to worry." His gaze shifted to Sarah and the 3 girls with open curiosity. "And you've brought guests." Before Cooper could make introductions, a woman in her 40s hurried out from behind the church, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. Clara. Henderson had the practical bearing of someone who'd spent years running a general store, but the recent tragedy had added new lines to her face and a wariness to her movements that spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. "Sheriff Cooper," Clara said, slightly out of breath, "we weren't expecting you back so soon. Is everything all right?" Her eyes took in Sarah's travel-worn dress, and the 3 girls clustered protectively around her. "Are these folks in need of shelter?" Sarah stepped forward before Cooper could respond, extending her hand to both the priest and Clara with the confident manner of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and these are Emma, Lucy, and Rose. We came to Millbrook Valley expecting to meet Henry Walsh, but Sheriff Cooper has explained what happened here." Father Santos's expression grew somber at the mention of Henry's name. "Ah, you are the bride Henry spoke of so often. I am deeply sorry for your loss, my child. He was a good man who spoke frequently of his hopes for the future you would build." Together, Emma, ever direct, looked around at the other buildings near the church. "How many people are staying here now?" 13 adults and 6 children, Clara replied, studying Emma's serious expression with approval. "We've been making do with what we could salvage and what the sheriff brings back from his patrols, but it's been difficult." Lucy had wandered toward a vegetable garden behind the church where several children were playing under the watchful eye of an older woman. "Are those children from the town too?" "Yes, sweetheart," Father Santos replied gently. "They lost their families during the attack, so we're all caring for them together now." Rose's eyes widened with sympathy. "They don't have anyone either, like us before Sarah?" The question hung in the air with painful clarity, and Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being reminded of how much these children had already endured. She placed a reassuring hand on Rose's shoulder while studying the layout of the church grounds with professional interest. "Father Santos," Sarah said, "Sheriff Cooper mentioned that Black Jack Reynolds and his gang are still operating in this area. What kind of security measures have you been able to implement here?" The priest exchanged glances with Clara, both of them clearly surprised by the directness of Sarah's question. Most women in her situation would be focused on comfort and safety, not tactical assessments. "We post watches during the day and keep everyone inside after dark," Clara replied slowly. "Doc Hayes has been teaching some of the older boys to handle rifles, but most of us aren't fighters." Cooper had been watching Sarah's face as she absorbed information about the survivor's situation, noting how her eyes constantly moved, cataloging details and assessing vulnerabilities. "Sarah has experience. That might be helpful," he said carefully. "She used to work as a Pinkerton agent." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Clara's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been hope, while Father Santos straightened with new interest. Even in the remote territories, the reputation of Pinkerton agents was well known. "A lady detective?" came a voice from behind them. They turned to see a tall, thin man in his 60s, approaching with the measured gait of someone who'd spent years making careful diagnoses. This had to be Doc Hayes, the physician who'd chosen to stay with the survivors, despite the danger. "Dr. Hayes," Cooper said by way of introduction. "This is Sarah Mitchell and her charges." "Sarah, Doc Hayes has been keeping everyone healthy and helping organize our defenses." Doc Hayes studied Sarah with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "Pinkerton, you said? That's quite a coincidence, having someone with your training arrive just when we need it most." Sarah smiled, but there was something in her expression that suggested she didn't believe much in coincidences. "Doctor, I'd like to hear your assessment of what happened during the attack. Sometimes medical details can provide insights that other observers might miss." The request clearly surprised him, but Doc Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "The wounds I treated suggested that Reynolds and his men are experienced fighters, not just common bandits. They knew exactly where to position themselves for maximum effect, and their shooting was precise enough to disable resistance without wasting ammunition." Emma had been listening intently to every word of the adult conversation, her young mind processing information with the same analytical approach she'd learned from Sarah. How many of them were there? Could you tell from the pattern of attacks? Doc Hayes looked impressed by the sophistication of Emma's question. "Based on the angles of gunfire and the timing of events, I'd estimate 15 to 20 men working in coordinated groups." Lucy, meanwhile, had been studying the church building itself with the observant eye that had served her well during their years in Chicago. "This building could be defended pretty well if you knew what you were doing," she announced matter-of-factly. "Good sight lines from the bell tower, solid construction, only a few approaches that attackers could use." Father Santos chuckled despite the serious nature of their discussion. "You have quite remarkable children, Miss Mitchell. They seem to understand tactical situations better than most adults." "They've had to learn to be observant," Sarah replied, pride evident in her voice. "Survival often depends on noticing details that others miss." Clara had been growing increasingly excited as she listened to the conversation. "Sheriff Cooper, if Miss Mitchell really has professional experience tracking criminals, maybe we finally have a chance to do something besides just hiding and hoping Reynolds moves on." Cooper found himself caught between hope and responsibility. Everything about Sarah's demeanor and the intelligent questions being asked by all three girls suggested that they were exactly what he needed to finally corner Reynolds and his gang. But they were also a woman and 3 children who'd already lost everything once, and he couldn't shake the feeling that encouraging them to get involved was fundamentally wrong. "The thing is," he said slowly, "Reynolds isn't just any criminal. He's been operating in this territory for years, and he's got connections that keep him informed about law enforcement activities. Every time I've gotten close to tracking him down, he's been one step ahead." Sarah's expression sharpened with professional interest. "What kind of connections? Local informants or something more organized?" "Both, I think. He seems to know when posses are being formed, when territorial marshals are in the area, even when individual lawmen are tracking him. It's like he's got eyes and ears everywhere." Emma stepped closer to Sarah, recognizing the subtle change in her guardian's posture that indicated she was shifting into her professional mindset. "Sarah, this sounds like the kind of case you used to tell us about. The ones where you had to think like the criminals to catch them." "It does sound familiar," Sarah agreed, her mind already working through possibilities. "Reynolds has been successful because he's been fighting predictable opposition. Local sheriffs, territorial posses, maybe the occasional federal marshal. They all follow standard procedures that experienced criminals learn to anticipate." Lucy had wandered over to examine the bell tower more closely, her natural curiosity drawing her toward the highest point on the property. "You could see for miles from up there," she called down. "Anyone approaching would be visible long before they could get close enough to be dangerous." Rose, not to be outdone by her older sisters, had discovered a water pump near the garden. "There's fresh water here too, and lots of food growing. This would be a good place to stay safe while you figure out how to catch the bad men." "Father." Santos smiled at Rose's innocent confidence. "From the mouths of babes," he murmured to Sarah. "Perhaps God has sent you to us for a reason beyond what any of us initially understood." Cooper was beginning to feel the weight of decision pressing down on him. Every instinct told him that working with Sarah Mitchell could finally give him the advantage he needed to bring Reynolds to justice. But every moral fiber in his being rebelled against the idea of putting 3 innocent children in harm's way, no matter how capable they seemed. "Miss Mitchell," he said formally, "I need to ask you directly. Are you really prepared to risk the lives of these girls in pursuit of men who've already proven they'll kill women and children without hesitation?" The question hit like a physical blow, and for a moment, Sarah's carefully controlled exterior cracked enough to show the depth of her protective instincts where the girls were concerned. But when she answered, her voice was steady and sure. "Sheriff Cooper, these girls are my responsibility, and I will never put them in unnecessary danger. But I've also learned that sometimes the greatest danger comes from running away and hoping that evil men will choose to leave you alone." She gestured toward the ruins visible in the distance. "Reynolds has already taken away the safe home I promised them. If we don't stop him, he'll keep taking homes away from other families, other children." Emma moved to stand beside Sarah, her young face set with determination that reminded Cooper of soldiers he'd known during the war. "We're not helpless, Sheriff. Sarah taught us how to take care of ourselves, how to be useful instead of just being protected. And we're good at helping catch bad people, Lucy added from her position near the bell tower. We know how to watch and listen and remember things that adults might forget. Cooper looked around at the faces surrounding him. Father Santos with his quiet faith, Clara with her practical hope, Doc Hayes with his analytical mind, and the three girls who seemed far more capable than their ages suggested. But it was Sarah's face that held his attention. The way her green eyes showed both fierce protectiveness and professional competence in equal measure. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. Sarah's smile was swift and confident. First, we gather intelligence. Reynolds has been successful because he knows this territory and has information sources, but he doesn't know about me. A former Pinkerton agent asking the right questions in the right places might learn things that a local sheriff couldn't. Clara stepped forward eagerly. I still have contacts at trading posts and settlements throughout the territory. People talk to storekeepers, tell them things they might not share with lawmen. And I travel between communities providing medical care, Doc Hayes added. I hear conversations that people forget as soon as I leave. Father Santos nodded thoughtfully. The church has connections as well. People confess things to priests that they would never tell anyone else. Cooper felt a spark of genuine hope for the first time in weeks. You're talking about creating an intelligence network, using resources that Reynolds wouldn't expect or prepare for. Exactly, Sarah. Confirmed. But more than that, we changed the rules of engagement entirely. Instead of chasing Reynolds after he's already struck, we figure out where he's going to strike next, and we're waiting for him. Emma had been following the strategic discussion with intense concentration. Like setting a trap instead of following tracks, she said, proving that she understood the fundamental shift in approach they were discussing. Lucy descended from the bell tower with the quick grace of childhood. I could see 3 different trails leading up into the mountains from here. If someone knew which one the bad men were using, they could watch for them coming and going. Rose had been playing with the children from the garden, but she returned to the group with grass stains on her dress and important information. The kids said the bad men came from the North Trail when they attacked the town. They saw them riding early in the morning before most people were awake. Cooper stared at Rose in amazement. In 5 minutes of playing, she learned something I've been trying to figure out for 3 weeks. Children notice different things than adults, Sarah explained. They don't filter information the same way, so they often remember details that seem unimportant to grown-ups. Doc Hayes chuckled appreciatively. Miss Mitchell, I'm beginning to think you and these girls might be exactly what this situation needs. But what about Reynolds' information network? Won't he learn about your arrival just like he's learned about other threats? Sarah's expression became thoughtful. That depends on how carefully we control information. As far as anyone outside, this group knows. I'm just Henry Walsh's intended bride who arrived too late and decided to stay and help with the survivors. Nothing threatening about a widow with 3 children. But underneath, you'll be gathering intelligence and planning. Operations, Cooper said, beginning to understand the elegance of her approach. Exactly. Reynolds is expecting to face predictable opposition, local lawmen, maybe territorial marshals, possibly military forces if things get bad enough. He's not expecting to face someone who understands his methods and can turn them against him. Clara had been growing more excited as the plan took shape. We could use the trading post network to track his movements, figure out his patterns. Store owners hear everything and see everyone who passes through. And medical calls would give me legitimate reasons to travel throughout the territory, Doc Hayes added. I could gather information while appearing to go about my normal business. Father Santos smiled with quiet satisfaction. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but perhaps not so mysterious after all. Miss Mitchell, I believe you may be the answer to prayers we didn't even know we were praying. Cooper found himself nodding despite his lingering concerns. The territorial marshal won't be able to spare men for at least another month, and by then Reynolds will have hit half a dozen more settlements. If we're going to stop him, it has to be soon, and it has to be us. Emma looked around at the adults with the seriousness that had become her default expression. When do we start? The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with implication. Once they committed to this course of action, there would be no backing down, no pretending that they were just innocent survivors hoping to rebuild their lives in peace. Sarah looked at each of the three girls in turn, seeing in their faces the same determination that had carried them through years of hardship in Chicago. They'd already lost so much, and she'd promised them safety and security in their new home. But sometimes, she'd learned, the only way to create safety was to face danger directly. "We start tomorrow," she said simply. "But tonight we rest and we plan. Father Santos, could we impose on your hospitality for the evening? I'd like to hear everything you can tell me about what happened during the attack, and I want the girls to get acquainted with the other children." "Of course, my child. You are most welcome here for as long as you need." As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, Sarah Mitchell stood looking out over the ruins of Millbrook Valley and felt the familiar stirring of purpose that she'd thought she'd left behind with her Pinkerton career. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just tracking criminals for an agency or a paycheck. This time she was fighting for the future of three children who depended on her, and for the memory of all the innocent people who died because one man believed that violence gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. Cooper joined her at the edge of the church grounds, following her gaze toward the distant mountains where Reynolds and his gang were presumably hiding. "Miss Mitchell, I have to ask, are you really sure about this? Once we start active operations against Reynolds, there's no guarantee we'll be able to protect everyone here if things go wrong." Sarah turned to face him, and in the fading light, he could see both the gentleness that made her such an effective guardian for the girls, and the steel that had made her a successful Pinkerton agent. "Sheriff Cooper, I've learned that there are no guarantees in life except the ones we create for ourselves. Reynolds took away the safe future I promised these girls. Now I'm going to take away his ability to do the same thing to other families." As darkness settled over the Colorado territory, the survivors at the church settled in for what they hoped would be their last night of simply hiding and hoping. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of something new, not just the pursuit of justice, but the transformation of victims into hunters, of the hunted into the ones setting the trap. In the bell tower, Lucy kept the first watch with Doc Hayes, her young eyes scanning the mountain trails for any sign of movement. Down in the church, Emma helped Clara prepare sleeping arrangements for everyone, while Rose played quietly with the orphaned children, bringing smiles to faces that had seen too much sadness. And in the small room that had once been Father Santos's study, Sarah Mitchell sat with maps and papers spread before her, planning the kind of operation she'd thought she'd never conduct again. But as she worked, she could hear the soft voices of children settling down for sleep, and she knew that everything she'd learned in her previous career had been preparing her for this moment, this fight, this chance to prove that mercy and justice could be stronger than violence and greed. The transformation had begun, though Reynolds and his gang didn't know it yet. The quiet widow with 3 children who'd arrived on the afternoon train was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything she cared about to protect. The morning brought with it a crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and the distant smoke from campfires scattered throughout the territory. Sarah had risen before dawn, a habit from her Pinkerton days that served her well when planning operations required clear thinking and uninterrupted time. She stood at the window of the small room Father Santos had provided, studying the trails visible in the early light, and committing the landscape to memory with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival often depended on knowing every possible escape route. Emma found her there an hour later, already dressed and carrying a cup of coffee that Claire had brewed from their carefully rationed supplies. The 16-year-old moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to be helpful without being asked, understanding instinctively that adults planning dangerous work needed both support and space to think. "The others are starting to wake up," Emma reported softly, settling beside Sarah at the window. "Lucy's already been up to the bell tower twice to check the trails, and Rose made friends with all the orphaned children yesterday evening. They're calling her their little sister." Sarah smiled at that, knowing how much Rose thrived when she felt needed and important. "And how are you feeling about everything we discussed last night?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness that had become her default approach to life. "Scared," she admitted honestly, "but not the kind of scared that makes you want to hide, the kind that makes you want to do something important before the fear gets worse." The honesty in Emma's voice reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with these three girls in the first place. They faced hardship with a courage that most adults never managed to find, and they trusted her enough to follow wherever she led them. It was both a gift and a responsibility that sometimes felt almost overwhelming. "That's exactly the right kind of scared," Sarah assured her, reaching over to squeeze Emma's hand. "It means you understand that what we're doing matters, but you're not letting the fear make your decisions for you." Lucy appeared in the doorway at that moment, slightly out of breath from her morning reconnaissance. "Sarah, there are riders coming from the east. Two men, moving fast but trying not to look like they're in a hurry." Sarah's expression sharpened immediately, and she moved to the window with the fluid grace of someone whose training had never truly left her. In the distance, she could see two mounted figures following the main trail toward the church, their body language suggesting urgency beneath a facade of casual travel. "Get Sheriff Cooper," she instructed Emma quietly, "and ask Father Santos to gather everyone inside the church, but don't make it look like we're responding to a threat. Just a normal morning meeting." As Emma hurried away, Sarah continued studying the approaching riders. Something about their movement pattern suggested they weren't random travelers or even Reynolds's scouts conducting routine surveillance. These men had specific purpose and information that was driving their hasty approach. Cooper appeared beside her within minutes, his hand resting automatically on his gun while he assessed the situation through the window. "You think they're Reynolds's men?" "Possibly, but not necessarily hostile," Sarah replied, noting details about the riders' equipment and bearing. "They're armed but not positioned for an attack, and they're approaching openly rather than trying to scout from concealment. My guess is they're bringing information rather than looking for trouble." Lucy had remained at her post by the window, her young eyes picking out details that the adults might miss. "The one in front has a badge," she announced. "I can see the reflection when the sun hits it just right." Cooper's tension eased slightly. "Probably deputies from one of the neighboring counties, or maybe territorial marshals finally responding to my requests for assistance." The riders turned out to be Deputy Marshal James Crawford from the Denver Territorial Office and a local sheriff named Pete Williams from a county roughly 50 miles to the south. Both men looked worn out from several days on the trail, their clothes dusty and their horses clearly fatigued. Father Santos met them warmly at the steps of the church, his signature hospitality evident. While Sarah observed quietly from the doorway, the three girls gathered close to her. She preferred to remain unseen for the moment, knowing that people revealed more when they didn't realize they were being watched. "Marshal Crawford," Father Santos said with a welcoming tone, "what brings you all the way out here to our quiet corner of the territory?" Crawford, a steady silver-haired man shaped by years of confronting violence on the frontier, dismounted slowly, clearly relieved to be off his horse. "Father, we've been chasing Black Jack Reynolds and his gang across 3 counties. Every town we've passed through reports the same thing: methodical raids, expertly carried out, and always just ahead of any pursuit. Sheriff Williams, younger and less seasoned, scanned the church grounds with visible worry. "We heard about the Millbrook Valley attack, but we didn't expect to find anyone still around. Isn't it risky staying here with Reynolds still active in the area?" Just then, Cooper stepped out of the church. Sarah noticed the mix of emotions on his face: relief that help had arrived, frustration at how long it had taken, and an awareness that these officials could complicate the strategy he and Sarah had been quietly constructing. "Marshal Crawford, Sheriff Williams," Cooper said formally, extending a hand. "I'm Sheriff Daniel Cooper. I sent the request for backup that brought you here." Crawford gave Cooper a thoughtful look, the kind that assessed a man's competence in seconds. "Sheriff Cooper, your reports on Reynolds have been impressively thorough. Most local sheriffs don't have the tactical background to provide the kind of intelligence you've been sending." Sarah allowed herself a faint smile. Cooper had clearly been using insights from their planning sessions in his reports without ever disclosing the source. "I've had help from some of the survivors," Cooper said diplomatically. "People who saw the attack firsthand were able to share important details I might have missed on my own." Williams's interest grew as he looked around. "There are witnesses here? That's rare. Most people fled as soon as they could." Before Sarah could respond, Emma stepped forward, seizing the moment to learn more while appearing like a curious teenager. "We just got here yesterday, but the folks here told us a lot about what happened. Are you really here to catch the men who did it?" Crawford smiled at her straightforwardness. "That's exactly why we're here. We believe we're finally close to catching Reynolds and his crew." Lucy joined in, as usual unwilling to miss a good conversation. "How many men are you chasing?" "People here said there were maybe 20 in the gang. Most of our intel puts the main group at around 15 to 18, Crawford replied, clearly noting the sharpness of her question. "Though they often hire extra help for larger operations." At that, Sarah decided it was time to step forward, sensing that the lawman could be both a valuable resource and a complication. She emerged from the church with Rose beside her, appearing to be just another concerned survivor seeking answers. "Gentlemen," she said with calm politeness, "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I came to Millbrook Valley to meet my fiancé, but clearly plans have changed." Crawford tipped his hat respectfully, while Williams gave her a longer look, noting how composed she seemed despite the tragedy. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," Williams said. "These are tough times." "Thank you, Marshal," Sarah replied graciously. "Do you have any insight into Reynolds's behavior? People here are trying to decide whether it's safe to rebuild or if there's a risk he might return." The question was intentionally crafted to gather information without revealing her own strategic thinking. She studied their faces as they weighed what to say in front of civilians. Crawford exchanged a glance with Williams before answering. "Reynolds usually doesn't hit the same place twice unless he believes there's something he missed. His usual tactic is to strike fast, loot, and move on. But he's been in this region longer than usual," Williams added, earning a quick, warning look from Crawford for saying more than he perhaps should have. "We suspect he's planning something bigger than usual." Cooper listened carefully, realizing the presence of official lawmen could interfere with the covert preparations he and Sarah had underway. "Marshal, what kind of assistance can you provide for local defense while you're tracking Reynolds?" he asked. "We're authorized to form posses from the local population and work with the territorial militia if needed," Crawford explained. "But our top priority is to stay on Reynolds's trail." Sarah could feel the larger picture becoming clearer. Pieces were falling into place, both opportunities and new challenges for the plans she and Cooper had begun shaping. If Crawford and Williams were here with official backing, it meant that Reynolds's activities had attracted attention at the territorial level. But it also meant that any operations she and Cooper conducted would need to be coordinated with official efforts, or at least appear to be supporting them rather than operating independently. Emma had been following the adult conversation with her usual intensity, and Sarah could see questions forming in the girl's expression that could potentially reveal more about their capabilities than would be wise. She caught Emma's eye and gave a subtle shake of her head, a signal the girls had learned meant to wait and listen rather than actively participating. "Marshal Crawford," Father Santos interjected diplomatically, "perhaps you and Sheriff Williams would like to rest and refresh yourselves before continuing your pursuit. We have modest accommodations, but you're welcome to share what we have." Crawford smiled gratefully. "That's very generous, Father, but we need to keep moving. Every day we delay gives Reynolds more time to plan his next attack." He paused, studying the faces around him. "Though I would like to interview any witnesses who might be able to provide additional details about the attack on Millbrook Valley." Doc Hayes emerged from one of the outbuildings at that moment, carrying his medical bag and wearing the slightly distracted expression of someone who'd been dealing with patient care since before dawn. "Marshal Sheriff," he said with professional courtesy, "I'm Dr. William Hayes. I've been treating the survivors here, and I can provide medical details about the attack that might be useful for your investigation." "Dr. Hayes," Crawford replied with obvious interest, "any information you can provide would be extremely valuable. We're trying to build a complete picture of Reynolds's methods and capabilities." As the adults moved into more detailed discussions about the attack, Sarah found herself studying the two lawmen with professional interest. Crawford had the experience and authority to potentially make a real difference in pursuing Reynolds, but he also represented the kind of bureaucratic constraints that had sometimes frustrated her during her Pinkerton days. Williams seemed competent, but inexperienced, the kind of officer who might be useful as long as he was properly directed. Lucy appeared at Sarah's elbow with the silent approach she'd perfected during their years in Chicago. "They don't know about the trails," she whispered quietly. "I heard them talking to their horses about following the main roads, but Reynolds has been using the mountain paths that only local people know about." The observation was exactly the kind of tactical insight that could make the difference between success and failure in tracking a elusive quarry. Sarah squeezed Lucy's shoulder appreciatively while considering how to share that information without revealing how they'd come to possess it. Rose had been playing quietly nearby with some of the orphaned children, but Sarah noticed that she was also listening carefully to the adult conversations with the focused attention that suggested she was absorbing more information than anyone might expect from an 8-year-old. "Rose," Sarah called softly, "what have you learned from playing with the other children this morning?" Rose approached with the careful consideration she always showed when asked to report on something important. "They said the bad men have been using the old mining trails to move around without being seen. The children know about them because they used to explore up there before it became dangerous." Crawford, who had been listening to Doc Hayes' medical report, turned sharply at Rose's comment. "Old mining trails? We haven't heard anything about alternative routes through this territory." Cooper stepped forward smoothly. "There are several abandoned mining operations in the mountains above here, some dating back 10 or 15 years. The trails were cut to move equipment and supplies, but they've been mostly forgotten since the mines played out. And local children would know about them because they're natural places to explore," Sarah added, supporting Cooper's explanation while establishing a credible source for the information. "Children often know the landscape better than adults because they pay attention to different details." Williams pulled out a worn map and spread it on a nearby table. "Could you show us where these trails are located? If Reynolds is using them to avoid detection, it would explain how he's been staying ahead of our pursuit." Emma moved closer to examine the map with the kind of systematic attention that suggested she was memorizing every detail. "The children could probably show you the exact locations," she said helpfully. "They've been playing in these mountains their whole lives." Sarah felt a moment of maternal pride at how skillfully Emma was managing to provide valuable information while maintaining the appearance of simply being a helpful teenager. The girl was learning to think tactically, to understand how to support operations without revealing capabilities that needed to remain hidden. Crawford studied the map thoughtfully. If we could get accurate information about these alternative routes, we might finally be able to get ahead of Reynolds instead of constantly following his trail. I'd be happy to arrange for some of the local children to show you what they know, Father Santos offered. Though obviously we'd want to ensure their safety during any such operation. Of course, Crawford agreed quickly. We're not looking to put civilians in danger. We just need intelligence about terrain and possible routes. Sarah caught Cooper's eye and saw that he was thinking along the same lines she was. The arrival of official law enforcement represented both an opportunity and a complication, but it also provided cover for more extensive intelligence-gathering operations than they'd been able to conduct on their own. Marshal, she said carefully, if you're planning to establish a base of operations in this area, perhaps some of the survivors here could assist with logistics and local knowledge. We're obviously invested in seeing Reynolds captured, and we might be able to provide support that wouldn't be available elsewhere. Crawford considered her offer with obvious interest. What kind of support did you have in mind? Communications for one thing, Sarah replied, thinking quickly. Father Santos has connections throughout the territory. Dr. Hayes travels to provide medical care, and some of the other survivors have contacts at trading posts and settlements. If you need to coordinate with other law enforcement agencies or gather information about Reynolds' movements, we might be able to help establish those connections. The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity, Sarah realized. By positioning themselves as support personnel for official operations, they could gather intelligence and coordinate activities without revealing their own capabilities or intentions. Crawford would get the local assistance he needed, while they would get access to official resources and information. Williams nodded enthusiastically. That could be extremely valuable, Marshal. We've been having trouble coordinating with local authorities because communication is so difficult across these distances. And if Reynolds is planning something bigger than his usual operations, Cooper added, having local people watching for unusual activity could provide early warning that might save lives. Crawford was clearly warming to the idea. Miss Mitchell, if you and the other survivors would be willing to assist with coordination and intelligence gathering, it could make a significant difference in our ability to track Reynolds effectively. Sarah smiled with what she hoped appeared to be simple civic-minded determination. Marshal, we've all lost something to Reynolds and his gang. If we can help ensure that he's brought to justice, we're more than willing to do whatever we can. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains, Sarah Mitchell found herself in the unexpected position of having official sanction for exactly the kind of intelligence gathering operation she'd been planning to conduct independently. Crawford and Williams represented complications, but they also provided resources and authority that could significantly improve their chances of success. More importantly, the arrival of territorial law enforcement meant that Reynolds would be facing coordinated pressure from multiple directions for the first time in his criminal career. The question now was whether Sarah and her improvised team could gather information and set traps faster than Reynolds could adapt to the changing threat environment. Standing at the church steps watching Crawford and Williams examine their maps with renewed purpose, Sarah felt the familiar stirring of anticipation that had always preceded her most successful cases during her Pinkerton days. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just tracking criminals for professional satisfaction. This time she was fighting for the future of 3 children who trusted her completely, and for the memory of all the innocent people who'd died because no one had been able to stop Reynolds before he reached their community. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since stepping off the train in the ruins of Millbrook Valley, Sarah Mitchell felt like they might actually have a chance of winning. The week that followed brought a flurry of activity that transformed the quiet church grounds into something resembling a military outpost. Marshal Crawford had established his temporary headquarters in Father Santos's study, while Sheriff Williams coordinated with local volunteers who'd begun arriving from neighboring settlements. The news that territorial authorities were finally taking action against Reynolds had spread quickly, drawing men who'd lost livestock, property, or family members to the gang's depredations. Sarah found herself walking a careful line between appearing to be a helpful civilian coordinator and conducting the kind of professional intelligence analysis that could reveal her true capabilities. She'd positioned herself as the primary liaison between the official operation and the local survivors, a role that gave her access to all incoming information while allowing her to subtly guide strategic decisions without appearing to take control. Emma had proven invaluable in this delicate balance, serving as Sarah's unofficial deputy in managing communications and logistics. The 16-year-old possessed a natural talent for organizing complex information and presenting it in ways that made busy officials feel like their time was being used efficiently. More importantly, she understood instinctively how to gather intelligence during routine conversations without arousing suspicion. "Sarah," Emma reported quietly as they stood examining the large map that now dominated one wall of the church's main room. "I've been talking to the volunteers as they arrive, and there's a pattern in Reynolds's recent attacks that the marshal might not be seeing." Sarah moved closer to the map, noting the colored pins that Crawford had used to mark known attack sites and suspected hideouts. "What kind of pattern?" "He's been hitting settlements that are connected to the railroad in some way," Emma explained, pointing to specific locations. "Not necessarily towns that have actual stations, but places that supply goods or services to the railroad companies." The observation was brilliant in its simplicity, and Sarah felt a surge of professional pride at how quickly Emma was learning to think like an investigator. That could indicate that Reynolds is planning something involving the railroad itself, rather than just random raids on communities. Lucy appeared at Sarah's shoulder with the silent approach she'd perfected. "I've been listening to the telegraph messages Crawford's been receiving from other law enforcement agencies," she reported with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who didn't consider eavesdropping on official communications to be particularly unusual. "There have been 3 attempted train robberies in the past month, all unsuccessful because the gangs weren't organized enough." Sarah paused in her examination of the map, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place in her mind. "Lucy, that's extremely valuable information. What else have you learned from the telegraph traffic?" "The railroad companies are getting nervous about security, especially for shipments carrying payroll money for mining operations," Lucy continued. "They've been asking for military escorts, but the Army doesn't have enough personnel to protect every train." Emma had been following the conversation with growing excitement. So if Reynolds is planning something bigger than usual, it might be targeting a specific train shipment rather than just another settlement. Sarah nodded approvingly, impressed by how quickly both girls were developing their analytical skills. "And if he's been conducting reconnaissance on railroad-connected communities, he's probably trying to identify the most valuable and vulnerable targets." Rose materialized beside them with the sudden appearance that seemed to be a family trait. "The children from town said their fathers used to talk about the big payroll shipments that came through every month," she announced. "They said it was enough money to buy a whole town." The information hit Sarah like a physical blow. Monthly payroll shipments for the mining operations involved enormous amounts of money, far more than Reynolds could hope to steal from isolated settlements. If he was planning to target one of those trains, it would explain why he'd stayed in the area longer than usual and why he didn't seem concerned about drawing attention from territorial law enforcement. "Rose, sweetheart, do you know when those payroll shipments usually pass through?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice light despite the urgency behind her words. Rose furrowed her brow, trying to remember. The other kids said it's always at the end of the month when their dads get paid from the mines. And everyone knew how much money was on the train, so it was always really well guarded. Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with Emma. The implications were immediate and alarming. If Reynolds was preparing to hit a payroll train, and if those trains passed through at the end of the month, then they had less than a week to stop. What could become the most devastating robbery the territory had seen in years. Emma, find out today's date, but do it casually. Don't let anyone know we're not sure, Sarah said in a low voice. Lucy, check the telegraph traffic, see if you can learn anything about the schedule or route for those payroll trains. Just then, Marshal Crawford reappeared, clearly frustrated and worn out. His expression suggested that the investigation wasn't progressing the way he'd hoped. Miss Mitchell, he called out, do you have a moment? I'd like your help coordinating some scouting efforts. We're having trouble narrowing down Reynolds' current position. Sarah approached with the calm, cooperative demeanor of a helpful local, even as her mind worked rapidly through the connections her girls had just uncovered. If Crawford wasn't already aware of the payroll shipment as a potential target, she'd need to share that intel without giving away the depth of their strategic insight. Of course, Marshal, she replied politely. What kind of scouting are you planning? He unrolled a detailed topographical map across a table, pointing to several spots marked in red. We suspect Reynolds may be hiding somewhere in the mountain regions above us. These are locations we want to investigate, but we'll need help from locals familiar with the terrain. Sarah studied the map and immediately noticed a flaw. The marked areas were all along major trails, places an outsider might guess, but not where someone with true knowledge of the landscape would hide. Have you had a chance to talk to the children about those old mining trails we discussed earlier? Sarah asked. They might be able to point out places that wouldn't stand out to people unfamiliar with the area. Crawford sighed. We've been so tied up working with other agencies that we haven't done much local reconnaissance yet. Do you think the children would be willing to help? Emma stepped in smoothly. I can set up a meeting with the kids who know the trails best. They trust us. And they want to help catch the ones responsible for hurting their families. That would be very helpful, Crawford said gratefully. Just make sure no children are put at risk. We only need knowledge of the landscape and access points. Sensing another opportunity, Sarah added, while we're organizing that, maybe Sheriff Cooper could gather some of the adult survivors to discuss local transport patterns like train schedules. If Reynolds is planning another hit, understanding the timing could help us anticipate his next move. Crawford nodded with enthusiasm. Excellent thinking. If we can get ahead of him instead of chasing behind, we'll finally have the upper hand. As the marshal returned to his work, Sarah brought the girls back around the map table, taking advantage of the bustling activity inside the church to speak without being overheard. Emma, what's today's date? She asked quietly. The 23rd, Emma whispered. So if the payroll train comes at the end of the month, we've got less than a week. Lucy had been focused on the map and now pointed to a winding rail line through a mountain pass about 20 miles east. If I were planning a train robbery, I'd hit it here, she said confidently. It's remote, the train slows down for the curves, and there are plenty of ways to escape into the mountains. Sarah followed Lucy's line of thought and felt her instincts confirm it. It was an ideal ambush spot, difficult for law enforcement to reach quickly and full of tactical advantages. That's a sharp analysis, Lucy, Sarah said. But how do we pass that information to Marshal Crawford without giving away how detailed our thinking is? Rose, who had been quietly absorbing everything, chimed in with a thoughtful suggestion. Why don't we just say the kids saw men watching the trains from that spot? Grown-ups never think it's strange when kids remember weird things like that. The idea was so straightforward and so effective that Sarah had to resist the urge to wrap Rose in a tight hug. Using the children's observations as a cover for strategic intelligence was exactly the kind of approach that could work without raising suspicion. "That's brilliant, Rose," Sarah said warmly. "But we'll have to be very careful about how we tell that story. Marshal Crawford needs to believe he's getting spontaneous intelligence from concerned civilians, not organized analysis from trained investigators." Emma had been thinking through the logistics of sharing information without arousing suspicion. What if we organized that children's meeting Crawford requested, and during the discussion, some of the local children mentioned seeing suspicious activity near the train route? It would be natural for them to remember details like that. And we could suggest that Crawford might want to investigate those areas more thoroughly, Lucy added, without making it seem like we're trying to direct his operations. Sarah felt a surge of pride at how quickly the girls were learning to think tactically about intelligence operations. They understood instinctively that the most effective information sharing often required careful manipulation of how knowledge was presented and received. Sheriff Cooper approached their table at that moment, looking like a man who'd been dealing with frustrated officials and incomplete information for hours. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "Crawford's been asking questions about our local intelligence gathering. I think he's starting to wonder how we've been getting such detailed information about Reynolds's activities." The warning was clear and necessary. If Crawford began investigating too closely how their intelligence network functioned, he might discover capabilities that could compromise their entire operation. Sarah needed to find a way to redirect his attention toward productive activities, while maintaining the appearance of simple civilian cooperation. "Sheriff Cooper," she replied carefully, "perhaps it's time to organize that meeting with the local children about the mountain trails. If we can provide Marshal Crawford with specific geographic information, it might answer his questions about our intelligence sources while giving him actionable information for his investigation." Cooper nodded understanding. "I'll suggest to Crawford that we organize a formal intelligence gathering session with all the local survivors. Make it look like we're just being thorough about collecting witness statements and local knowledge." Doc Hayes joined their conversation, his medical bag in hand and his expression showing the weariness of someone who'd been caring for patients while trying to support law enforcement activities. "If you're planning to organize a community meeting, you should know that several of the adult survivors have been asking questions about our long-term security situation." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, recognizing that civilian concerns could either support or complicate their operations depending on how they were managed. "Whether it's safe to start rebuilding, whether Reynolds is likely to return, whether they should relocate to other communities," Doc Hayes explained. "People are scared, and they're looking for guidance about what to do next." Sarah realized that the concerns of the civilian survivors represented both a challenge and an opportunity. If people were frightened enough to consider leaving the area, it could disrupt the intelligence network and support structure they'd been building. But their desire for security and guidance also meant they would be receptive to plans that promised to resolve the Reynolds threat permanently. "Dr. Hayes," she said thoughtfully, "what if we organize a community meeting that addresses both Crawford's need for local intelligence and the survivors' need for information about future security? We could present it as a planning session for long-term reconstruction efforts." "That's an excellent idea," Cooper agreed immediately. "Crawford gets his intelligence gathering session, the civilians get answers about their future, and we get an opportunity to coordinate everyone's efforts around a comprehensive plan." Emma had been listening to the adult conversation while studying the map, and she looked up with an expression that suggested she'd identified another important element of their situation. "Sarah, if we're planning a community meeting anyway, shouldn't we also discuss what happens if Reynolds strikes before Marshal Crawford can organize an effective pursuit?" The question hit like cold water, forcing everyone to confront the reality that their intelligence gathering and planning activities might not be enough to prevent Reynolds from conducting whatever operation he was preparing. If he was indeed planning to rob a payroll train in the next week, There was no guarantee that Crawford's official investigation would move quickly enough to intercept him. Lucy had been thinking along similar lines. What if we're wrong about the train robbery? What if Reynolds decides to hit another settlement while everyone's focused on protecting the railroad? Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her as she considered the multiple scenarios and risks they were facing. Crawford's official operation provided resources and authority, but it also moved with the deliberate pace of bureaucratic coordination. The intelligence they'd gathered suggested urgent threats that might require faster and more flexible responses than official channels could provide. Rose tugged on Sarah's sleeve with the persistence that only 8-year-olds could muster. Sarah, what happens if the bad men find out that everyone's working together to catch them? Won't that make them more dangerous? The question was uncomfortably perceptive. If Reynolds discovered that territorial authorities and local survivors were coordinating against him, he might accelerate his timeline or change his targets in ways that could put innocent people at even greater risk. The intelligence-gathering activities that were intended to protect the community could actually increase the danger if Reynolds learned about them. Father Santos approached their group with the quiet dignity that had made him a respected leader throughout the territory's difficult recent months. "My children," he said gently, "I've been listening to your discussions, and I believe it's time for us to have a serious conversation about the moral complexities of what we're attempting." Sarah looked up at the priest with surprise, not having expected philosophical concerns to arise in the middle of tactical planning. "Father Santos, what kind of moral complexities?" "The question of whether we're pursuing justice or revenge," Father Santos replied seriously. "Whether our desire to protect innocent people is leading us toward actions that might compromise our own souls." The priest's words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone to confront questions they'd been avoiding in their focus on operational details. Sarah felt the familiar tension between professional necessity and personal morality that had sometimes complicated her Pinkerton cases, but this time the stakes felt more personal and more complex. Emma stepped closer to Father Santos with the respectful attention she always showed to adult authority figures. "Father, what's the difference between justice and revenge? If we stop Reynolds from hurting more people, does it matter why we do it?" "It matters because our motivations shape our actions," Father Santos replied gently. "If we act from a desire for justice, we seek to protect the innocent and restore peace. If we act from revenge, we risk becoming like the men we oppose." Sarah found herself studying the faces around her, seeing the same conflict reflected in everyone's expressions. They were all motivated by legitimate desires to protect their community and prevent future tragedies, but they were also driven by anger and loss that could easily transform noble intentions into something darker. "Father," she said carefully, "what would you counsel us to do? Stand aside and hope that Marshal Crawford's official investigation is sufficient, or take active steps to protect people, even if those steps might compromise our moral standing?" Father Santos smiled with the gentle wisdom of someone who'd spent years helping people navigate difficult ethical decisions. "I would counsel you to remember that courage and compassion are not mutually exclusive. We can act decisively to protect the innocent without losing sight of mercy and forgiveness." As evening approached over the Colorado mountains, Sarah Mitchell stood looking out over the church grounds where volunteers and officials continued their planning activities. The intelligence they'd gathered suggested that Reynolds was preparing for his most ambitious operation yet, while the arrival of territorial law enforcement provided both resources and complications for their response. But Father Santos's words had reminded her that the greatest challenge they faced wasn't tactical or logistical. It was the challenge of remaining true to their values while confronting men who acknowledged no moral constraints whatsoever. The question wasn't just whether they could stop Reynolds, but whether they could do so without losing the very qualities that made their cause worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring the community meeting that could determine how their improvised Alliance would face the final confrontation with Reynolds and his gang. And somewhere in the mountains above them, dangerous men were making their own plans, unaware that their intended victims had finally learned to fight back with intelligence, coordination, and the kind of quiet determination that had built communities throughout the frontier territories. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just their tactical skills, but their ability to prove that mercy and justice could triumph over violence and greed. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd hoped to protect would soon depend on decisions that would have to be made in moments when there was no time for careful moral deliberation. Sarah closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer for wisdom, knowing that the choices ahead would determine not just their survival, but the kind of people they would become in the aftermath of whatever was coming. The community meeting convened at dawn on the 26th of the month, with representatives from every surviving family gathered in the church's main sanctuary. Marshal Crawford had arranged the seating to facilitate both information sharing and security, while Sarah positioned herself where she could observe everyone's reactions without appearing to be in a leadership role. The morning light streaming through the church's simple windows illuminated faces marked by loss, determination, and the kind of quiet courage that emerges when ordinary people decide to take extraordinary action. Emma sat with the other teenagers, her notebook ready to record important details, while maintaining the appearance of simply being a helpful young person taking minutes. Lucy had positioned herself near the window where she could monitor the approaches to the church while appearing to focus on the adult discussions. Rose sat with the younger children, her innocent presence serving as a reminder of exactly what everyone was fighting to protect. Crawford opened the meeting with a summary of what his investigation had revealed about Reynolds's activities, carefully omitting any details that might compromise ongoing operations. Based on our intelligence gathering over the past week, he began, we believe Black Jack Reynolds is preparing for a significant operation that could endanger multiple communities throughout this territory. Father Santos had insisted on opening the meeting with a brief prayer for wisdom and protection, a gesture that seemed to calm the nervous tension that had been building throughout the week. Lord, he said quietly, grant us the courage to do what is right, the wisdom to choose the path of justice, and the strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Doc Hayes stood to address the medical concerns that had been weighing on everyone's minds. We've identified locations where wounded could be treated safely, and we've established supply caches with medical equipment positioned throughout the area. Whatever happens in the coming days, we'll be prepared to care for anyone who needs help. Clara Henderson rose from her seat near the front, her practical demeanor reflecting the organizational skills that had made her general store a community hub before the attack. We've coordinated with trading posts throughout the territory to ensure communication lines remain open regardless of what Reynolds might do to disrupt our operations. Sheriff Cooper approached the front of the church carrying a detailed map that showed not just the local geography, but the transportation routes and communication networks that could be affected by whatever Reynolds was planning. Ladies and gentlemen, he said seriously, we have reason to believe that Reynolds is preparing to target the monthly railroad payroll shipment that's scheduled to pass through Devil's Canyon Pass in 3 days. The announcement sent a ripple of concerned murmurs through the gathered community members. Everyone understood that a successful train robbery would provide Reynolds with enough resources to expand his operation significantly, potentially threatening settlements throughout the entire territory. Emma raised her hand with the polite attention-seeking gesture she'd perfected for situations where she needed to contribute information without appearing to take charge. Sheriff Cooper, if Reynolds succeeds in robbing that train, won't he have enough money to recruit many more men? Could this become a much bigger problem than just one gang? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking that Sarah had been teaching the girls, and Cooper nodded approvingly at Emma's insight. That's exactly right, Emma. A successful payroll robbery could transform Reynolds from a regional nuisance into a territorial threat. Marshal Crawford stepped forward to address the strategic implications of what they were facing. Which is why we're not just trying to capture Reynolds and his current gang. We're trying to prevent him from accessing the resources that would allow him to become a much more dangerous criminal organization. Lucy spoke up from her position near the window, her young voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from careful observation. If we know where he's planning to strike, and we know when the train will be there, couldn't we be waiting for him instead of chasing him after he's already committed the crime? The suggestion was tactically sound and strategically elegant, representing exactly the kind of proactive thinking that could transform them from reactive victims into effective defenders. Sarah felt a surge of pride at how naturally Lucy had grasped the fundamental principle of successful law enforcement operations. Crawford studied Lucy with obvious respect for her reasoning. That's precisely what we're planning, young lady. Instead of responding to crimes after they've been committed, we're going to be positioned to prevent the crime from succeeding in the first place. One of the adult survivors, a farmer named William Thompson, whose family had escaped the attack on Millbrook Valley, stood to voice the concern that had been troubling many of the community members. Marshal Crawford, what happens to us if this plan doesn't work? If Reynolds escapes, or if he decides to take revenge on the people who helped set the trap? The question forced everyone to confront the reality that their coordinated action against Reynolds carried significant risks for everyone involved. If their operation failed, they could face retaliation that would make the original attack on Millbrook Valley seem modest by comparison. Sarah rose from her seat with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Mr. Thompson, that's exactly why we're not going to fail," she said simply. "We've gathered more intelligence about Reynolds' operation than he's ever faced before. We've coordinated between official law enforcement and local communities in ways that he won't be expecting. And most importantly, we're fighting for our homes and our families while he's just fighting for money." Father Santos nodded approvingly at Sarah's response. "My children, we must remember that fear of failure cannot prevent us from attempting what is right. Sometimes the greatest risk comes from refusing to take action when action is needed." Rose stood on her chair so everyone could see her, her 8-year-old voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that only children seem to possess. "The bad men hurt lots of people because they thought nobody would stop them," she announced matter-of-factly. "But we're going to stop them so they can't hurt any more children." The simple statement seemed to crystallize everything the adults had been struggling to articulate about their motivations and their determination. They weren't just pursuing Reynolds for revenge or even for justice. They were acting to protect future victims, to prevent other children from experiencing the losses that had brought them all together. Crawford outlined the tactical plan that had emerged from their week of intelligence gathering and coordination. "We'll position observers at multiple points along Reynolds' likely approach routes to the canyon. When we confirm his movement toward the train, we'll coordinate a response that cuts off his escape routes while protecting the train and its passengers." Doc Hayes raised a practical concern that reflected his medical training. "Marshal, what provisions have been made for civilians who might be caught in the area if fighting breaks out? Train passengers, rail workers, anyone who might be in the wrong place at the wrong time?" "We've coordinated with the railroad to delay the train's departure until we can confirm the area is secure," Crawford replied. "And we've established safe zones where non-combatants can be protected if the situation becomes dangerous." Emma had been studying the tactical map with the intensity she brought to complex problems. "Marshal Crawford, what happens if Reynolds splits his gang and attacks multiple targets simultaneously? Could he use the train robbery as a distraction while hitting other communities?" The question demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking that impressed every adult in the room. Sarah recognized that Emma had identified one of the most dangerous scenarios they could face: A coordinated attack that would stretch their defensive resources beyond their limits. That's why we're maintaining communication with all the surrounding settlements, Cooper explained. If Reynolds tries to divide his forces, we'll know about it quickly enough to respond appropriately. Lucy had been monitoring the approaches to the church throughout the meeting, and she suddenly stiffened with attention, focused on something outside. "There are riders approaching," she announced quietly. 3 men, moving fast but trying to look casual. Sarah moved to the window beside Lucy, her trained eyes quickly assessing the approaching figures. Something about their movement pattern and equipment suggested they weren't random travelers or even Reynolds' typical scouts. These men had military bearing and official purpose that could significantly complicate their carefully laid plans. "Marshal Crawford," Sarah called softly. "You might want to see this." Crawford joined them at the window, and his expression immediately grew tense when he recognized the approaching riders. "Territorial officials from the governor's office," he explained grimly. "Which means our operation has attracted attention at the highest levels of territorial government." The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. If territorial officials were arriving unannounced, it meant that their coordination against Reynolds had either been specifically authorized by higher authorities or was about to be shut down by officials who preferred different approaches to the problem. Father Santos moved to the church entrance to greet the arriving officials with the diplomatic courtesy that had served him well in previous encounters with government representatives. "Gentlemen," he said graciously, "welcome to our humble church. How may we serve you?" The lead rider proved to be Territorial Governor Samuel Morrison himself, a distinguished man in his 50s whose presence indicated that the Reynolds situation had become a priority at the highest levels of Colorado territorial government. He was accompanied by 2 territorial rangers whose professional bearing suggested they were there for more than ceremonial purposes. "Father Santos," Governor Morrison said respectfully, "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but we've received reports about significant law enforcement activity in this area. I wanted to assess the situation personally before making decisions about additional territorial resources." Crawford stepped forward to greet the governor with the formal courtesy required when dealing with superior authority. "Governor Morrison, I'm Marshal James Crawford. We've been coordinating local response to the Reynolds gang's activities, and we believe we've identified an opportunity to apprehend them before they can conduct additional attacks." Governor Morrison studied Crawford with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating subordinates quickly and accurately. "Marshal Crawford, what kind of opportunity are we discussing?" "My reports suggest that Reynolds has been operating successfully in this territory for months despite previous law enforcement efforts." Sarah recognized that the governor's arrival represented both validation and potential interference with their operations. If Morrison was here personally, it meant territorial authorities were taking the Reynolds threat seriously enough to commit significant resources. But it also meant that their local coordination might be superseded by official operations that could be less flexible and less informed about local conditions. Emma approached the governor with the respectful confidence that had served her well in previous encounters with authority figures. "Governor Morrison, sir, the people here have been working with Marshal Crawford to share information about local conditions that might help capture Reynolds and his gang." Morrison smiled at Emma's direct approach. "Young lady, what kind of information have you been able to provide?" "Details about terrain, travel routes, and local patterns that Reynolds might not expect law enforcement to know about," Emma replied smoothly. "The children here know the mountain trails better than most adults, and they've seen things that might be important for tracking the gang." Lucy joined the conversation with information that demonstrated the sophistication of their intelligence gathering. "Governor Morrison, we've identified patterns in Reynolds' attacks that suggest he's planning to target the railroad payroll shipment that's scheduled for this week." The governor's expression sharpened with immediate interest. "What kind of patterns?" He's been conducting reconnaissance on communities that supply goods and services to railroad operations, Sarah explained, stepping forward to support the girls while presenting their analysis in terms that would be credible to official authorities. It suggests he's gathering intelligence for an operation targeting railroad assets rather than random community attacks. Governor Morrison turned to Crawford with obvious concern. "Marshal, is this intelligence assessment accurate? Are we potentially facing a train robbery rather than just continued raids on isolated settlements?" Crawford nodded grimly. "Our analysis supports that conclusion, Governor, which is why we've been coordinating with local communities to position resources for preventing the robbery rather than just responding to it after it occurs." One of the territorial rangers accompanying Morrison stepped forward with the kind of professional curiosity that suggested extensive law enforcement experience. "Marshal Crawford, what kind of local resources have you been able to coordinate? Trained personnel, equipment, logistical support?" Sheriff Cooper answered the question with careful attention to presenting their capabilities without revealing the full extent of Sarah's professional background. "We've organized communication networks, intelligence gathering from local contacts, and defensive preparations for protecting civilians. The survivors here have been remarkably helpful in providing local knowledge and support." Rose had been listening to the adult conversation with her usual focused attention, and she approached Governor Morrison with the kind of innocent directness that only 8-year-olds could manage. "Governor Morrison, are you here to help us catch the bad men who hurt our town?" Morrison knelt down to meet Rosie's eyes, his expression softening with genuine concern. "That's exactly why I'm here, sweetheart. We want to make sure that Reynolds and his gang can never hurt another community the way they hurt yours." Father Santos stepped forward to address the broader implications of the governor's presence. "Governor Morrison, what level of support can territorial authorities provide for our defensive efforts? These people have suffered greatly, and they deserve to know that their government stands behind them." Morrison rose to address the assembled community members with the kind of formal authority that carried the weight of territorial law. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that stopping Reynolds has become a priority for territorial authorities. We're prepared to commit whatever resources are necessary to ensure he's brought to justice." Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and concern at Morrison's declaration. Official support would provide resources and authority that could significantly improve their chances of success. But it might also mean that their carefully coordinated local operation would be absorbed into a larger official effort that could be less flexible and less responsive to rapidly changing conditions. "Governor Morrison," she said carefully, "the people here have developed relationships and coordination that took time to build. Would it be possible to integrate official support with local efforts rather than replacing them entirely?" Morrison studied Sarah with obvious interest, clearly recognizing that her question demonstrated more strategic sophistication than he would normally expect from civilian survivors. "Ma'am, what kind of local coordination are you referring to?" Emma stepped forward to answer before Sarah could respond, instinctively understanding that their capabilities needed to be presented as community efforts rather than professional operations. "Sir, we've been working together to share information, coordinate communications, and support Marshal Crawford's investigation. Everyone here wants to help catch Reynolds in whatever way they can." Lucy added supporting details that demonstrated the value of their local knowledge. "The children have been helping identify mountain trails and hiding places that Reynolds might use, and the adults have been coordinating with people throughout the territory to track his movements." Governor Morrison nodded approvingly at the girls' explanations. That's exactly the kind of local cooperation that makes law enforcement operations successful. "Marshal Crawford, how do you assess the value of this community coordination?" Crawford's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Governor, the local intelligence and support we've received here has been invaluable. These people understand the terrain, the community connections, and the local patterns in ways that outside law enforcement simply can't match. Morrison made a decision that would define how their final confrontation with Reynolds would unfold. Very well. We'll supplement local efforts with additional territorial resources rather than replacing them. Marshal Crawford will retain operational command, but he'll have access to additional personnel and equipment as needed. The announcement seemed to energize everyone in the church, providing both official validation and practical support for their efforts while maintaining the local coordination they'd worked so hard to develop. Doc Hayes raised a final practical concern that reflected his medical responsibilities. Governor Morrison, what provisions will be made for treating wounded if the confrontation with Reynolds results in casualties? We've brought military medical personnel who can supplement Dr. Hayes's efforts, Morrison replied. And we've arranged for emergency transportation to hospitals in Denver if serious injuries occur. As the community meeting concluded, Sarah found herself looking around at the faces of people who'd transformed from frightened survivors into determined defenders over the course of a single week. The three girls had proven themselves capable of analytical thinking and tactical contribution that impressed professional law enforcement officials. The adult survivors had demonstrated courage and coordination that exceeded anything she'd hoped for when they first arrived at the church. But most importantly, they'd maintained their commitment to justice rather than revenge, to protection rather than destruction, to building something better rather than simply tearing down what threatened them. Crawford approached Sarah as the crowd began to disperse, his expression showing both professional respect and personal gratitude. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that your coordination efforts have made the difference between a reactive investigation and a proactive operation. Without the intelligence and community support you've organized, we'd still be chasing Reynolds' trail instead of preparing to intercept his next attack. Sarah smiled with genuine warmth, feeling the satisfaction that came from successful coordination of complex operations. Marshal Crawford, these people deserved better than to be victims waiting for rescue. Sometimes the best protection comes from learning to protect yourself. Emma approached with her notebook filled with details from the meeting, her young face showing the kind of serious purpose that had become her trademark. Sarah, when do we move into position for the final operation? Tomorrow night, Sarah replied, recognizing that the time for preparation was ending and the time for action was beginning. Reynolds will position his gang for the train robbery on the morning of the 29th. We need to be in place before he arrives. Lucy had been studying the tactical maps with continued fascination. Will we get to help with the actual operation? Or will we have to stay at the church with the other children? Sarah looked at the three faces that had become more precious to her than her own life, weighing the competing demands of their safety and their obvious capabilities. You'll be positioned where you can contribute to communication and intelligence gathering without being exposed to direct danger. This operation depends on coordination, and coordination requires reliable people in key positions. Rose tugged on Sarah's skirt with a question that cut to the heart of everything they'd been working toward. After we catch the bad men, can we build our house here, like Mr. Walsh promised? The question reminded Sarah that their confrontation with Reynolds was about more than just stopping criminal activity. It was about reclaiming the future that had been stolen from them, about proving that ordinary people could create extraordinary results when they worked together with courage and determination. Yes, sweetheart, Sarah said firmly. After we stop Reynolds, we're going to build the kind of community where children can grow up safely, where families can prosper, and where good people look out for each other. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains on what would be their final night of preparation, Sarah Mitchell stood on the church steps, looking out over the valley where they'd first arrived as displaced refugees seeking shelter. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine whether their improvised alliance could triumph over organized violence, whether their commitment to justice could prove stronger than the criminals' dedication to profit and destruction. The three girls who'd started this journey as frightened orphans had become capable young women who understood both the cost of violence and the necessity of courage. The community that had begun as scattered survivors had transformed into a coordinated force that impressed professional law enforcement officials. And Sarah herself had rediscovered that her greatest strength lay not in her individual capabilities, but in her ability to help others find their own courage and competence. Reynolds and his gang still represented a dangerous threat, but they would face something they'd never encountered before, a community that had learned to fight back with intelligence, coordination, and the unshakable determination of people protecting everything they held dear. The legend that would emerge from Devil's Canyon would tell the story of how an ordinary mail-order bride and three orphan sisters had transformed a scattered group of survivors into the force that finally brought justice to the Colorado Territory. But the real victory wouldn't be in capturing criminals or preventing robberies. It would be in proving that mercy could be stronger than violence, that community could triumph over individual greed, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil was simply good people refusing to surrender to fear. The train whistle that had first brought them to this valley would soon carry a different kind of cargo, the knowledge that Black Jack Reynolds' reign of terror was finally over, and that the people of Colorado Territory had learned they possessed the strength to protect themselves and each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.